during recent strikes, and health officials were left guessing at the likely minimum coverage, making contingency planning almost impossible and putting everyone's constituents' lives at risk. The ambulance strike plan for tomorrow still do not have minimum safety levels in place. And this will result in patchy emergency care for the British people, and this cannot continue. It's for moments like this that we're introducing legislation, focusing on blue light emergency services and delivering on our manifesto commitment to secure minimum service on the railways as well. So I'm introducing a bill that will give government the power to ensure that vital public services will have to maintain a basic function by delivering minimum safety levels, ensuring that lives and livelihoods are not lost. Mr. Speaker, we're looking at 6 key areas, each of them critical for keeping the British people safe and society functioning. These are health, education, fire, rescue, transport, border security and nuclear decommissioning. We do not want to use this legislation, but we must ensure the safety of the British public. During the passage of the bill, we intend to consult on what an adequate level of coverage looks like in fire, ambulance and in rail services. For the other sectors covered in the bill, we hope to reach minimum service agreements that mean that we don't have to use that power in the bill, and they will be able to come to that position just as the nurses have done in the recent strikes. Mr. Speaker, this is a common sense approach, and we're not the first to follow it. The legislation will bring us in line with modern European countries like France and Spain and Italy and Germany, each of whom already have these types of rules in place. Even the guardians of workers' rights around the world, the International Labour Organization, to whom the TUC themselves subscribe, say that minimum service levels are a proportionate way of balancing the right to strike with the need to protect the wider public. Because the first job of any government is to keep the public safe. And unlike other countries, we are not proposing banning those strikes, but we do need to know that unions will be held to account. And members of opposition who object to minimum safety levels, well, they'll need to explain, Mr. Speaker, to their constituents why it is that if you had a heart attack, a stroke or life-threatening illness on a strike day, there are no minimum safety standards in place. And Mr. Speaker, I see they don't want to hear it, but they'll also need to explain why their leader, without hearing any of these details, has already promised to stand in the way of this legislation and to repeal minimum safety levels which are in the interests of their own constituents, safety levels that are in place in every other mature European democracy in our neighbours' countries that protect lives and will protect livelihoods in this country. And Mr. Speaker, that's the difference between Conservative government who take these difficult decisions and protect the welfare of our nation and the opposition who too often appear to be in the pay of their union paymasters. I commend this statement to the House.
I now call Shadow Secretary Angela Rayner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I refer the House to my register of interest and that I'm a proud member of a trade union. But what I want to start with by tackling the Secretary of State's comments is the first thing that comes to my mind in this debate, and what the Secretary of State said is my constituent Spina, who waited over an hour for an ambulance, who died waiting for an ambulance, and that was not on a strike day. That is because of the disastrous chaos we have in the system under this Conservative government. In the past few months, Mr. Speaker, we've seen ambulance workers go on their first major strike in 30 years, the first strike ever in the history of the Royal College of Nurses, teachers, pharmacists and civil servants, among others, balloting as we speak. His government offers no solution because they have caused the problem. The economic crisis made in Downing Street with high sky-high inflation and recession has left working people facing an economic emergency. And I recognise that the Secretary of State couldn't even mention the fact that they crashed the economy, let alone apologise for it in his opening statement. Nobody wants to see these strikes happen, Mr Speaker, least of all the workers who lose a day's pay. But, Mr Speaker, how is the government responding to the crisis of their own making? Not with any attempt to reach a serious long-term solution in the public interest, but by playing politics and promising yet another sticking plaster. He claims he made progress yesterday, but the readout from the trade union representatives was dismal. Is there any chance of a deal this year? Where is the consultation or meaningful way forward he mentions? Or was this all for show? Because that is the implication of his other proposal, his sacking nurses bill. An outright attack on the fundamental freedom of British working people. How can he say, with a straight face, that this government will always defend the ability to strike? Can he tell us if he stands by his article in the Telegraph last summer, listing yet more plans to attack that basic right? Does he deny they considered banning some key workers from joining a union at all? And so much for levelling up workers' rights, Mr Speaker. And where is their promised code of conduct on the fire and rehire, long-abandoned employment bill that they promised to tackle insecure work? How he goes on with one breath thanking nurses to sacking nurses, Mr Speaker. Not just insulting, but utterly stupid. There's no common sense about this at all. He says he recognises pressures faced by key workers, but he knows the NHS cannot find the nurses that they need to work on the ward. He knows the trains don't run even on non-strike days, such as their shortage of staff. So how can he seriously think that sacking thousands of key workers won't just plunge our public services further into crisis? The Transport Secretary admits it won't work. The Education Secretary doesn't want it. And his own government impact assessment finds that it will lead to more strikes and staff shortages. He says he's looking into 6 key areas. What do other ministers think about that? Will they have to disagree too? And if he is scraping the barrel with comparisons of France and Spain, those countries with those laws, he claims, so strikes, lose vastly more strike days than Britain. Has he taken any time at all to speak to their governments or trade unions to learn any real lessons from them? And he quotes the ILO. I'm surprised he even knows what the International Labour Organisation even is. He will know that the ILO requires compensatory measures and an independent arbitrator. Are those in his bill? The ILO also says minimum service levels can only happen in services when the safety of individuals or their health is at stake. This doesn't include transport, the border force and teachers as he proposes. Excess deaths, Mr Speaker, are at their highest levels since the pandemic peak. The public is being put at risk every day due to the government's NHS crisis and staffing shortages. He is right that it's his government's duty to protect the public's access to essential services, but livelihoods and lives are already being lost. We all want minimum standards of safety, service and staffing. It is the ministers failing to provide it. Does he not accept that trade unions and workers already take steps to protect the public during action? He singles out ambulance workers. Paramedics agreed to operate life and limb deals on a trust-by-trust basis, as he knows, to ensure the right care continued to be delivered. He should know that service levels were at 82%, with ambulance workers consistently leaving the picket lines to make sure that emergency calls were responded to. He is threatening, Mr Speaker, to rip up that protection. And for what for? Let's look into what this is really all about. A government that is out of ideas, out of time and fast running out of sticking plasters. A government that is playing politics with nurses and teachers' lives because they can't stomach the cooperation and negotiation that's needed. A government desperately doing all it can to distract from its economic emergency. Mr Speaker, we need negotiation, not legislation. So when is the Minister going to do his job?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, look, I mean, it's almost as if COVID and the pressures on the NHS never occurred, according to them. It's almost as if, and I'm pretty sure I heard this straight, it's almost as if Putin didn't invade Ukraine, force up energy prices, force up inflation, and it's almost as if the Honourable Lady opposite doesn't think that the rest of Europe is going through exactly the same thing. But I was just reading in the Guardian an article saying exactly this, that other health services are experiencing exactly the same problems. So if we're going to have a sensible debate about it, if we're going to start by working from the facts and then have a discussion, then we ought to acknowledge that COVID and the war in Ukraine are a huge impact on health services here and around the world. And then we can go on to have a sensible conversation about balancing the right to strike, which, as I said right at the top of my speech, is a right that we fully respect and that we fully endorse and we believe is part of the International Labour Organisation's correct diagnosis of a working economy, that people should be able to withdraw their labour. But, Mr. Speaker, that should not mean withdrawing their labour at the expense of our constituents' lives. And whilst the Honourable Lady talks about how the ambulance service, in her words, have been reasonable and offered on a trust-by-trust basis backup if there are people who have heart attacks, if there are people who have strokes. Heart attacks and strokes don't accept and don't work to the boundaries of trust borders. They work nationally. And so to manage the ambulance system, we need to know that each and every one of our constituents is protected. And so to deny and to vote against legislation that brings in minimum safety levels to help our constituents is to attack their security and their welfare.
Brendan Clark-Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As well as being completely unable to control their own MPs in terms of joining picket lines or actually give a straight answer as to whether they support any of these strikes or not, I think we can clearly see which members in this House are on the side of the public. So, does my right honourable friend agree with me that what we actually have today are fair and proportionate measures which are actually equivalent to what is already in place in a number of other European countries, such as France and Spain?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is absolutely right. It's worth the House reflecting that police were banned from striking in 1919, and that agreement's been in place for more than 100 years. It would have been very possible for a minister to come to this dispatch box and say they would do the same with perhaps ambulance workers and maybe with firefighters. That isn't what we're proposing today. We're proposing to bring ourselves in line with other modern European economies. It makes every bit of sense to make sure that if strikes are going to occur, that our constituents' lives are protected with minimum safety levels. Frankly, it's extraordinary that anyone would argue against.
Sorry, thank you, Mr. Speaker. 1 minute. Secretary of State, you're clapping.
Sorry, I do apologise. SNP spokesperson Alan Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it's this government that's already created the most restrictive anti-trade union laws in Europe. So this new right-wing culture war stinks, and they're using ambulance cover as a pretext to attack workers' rights. It was the Tory membership that gave us a Prime Minister who tanked the economy overnight, putting people's mortgages up and giving us higher inflation, and yet it's the Tories who continue to demand that public sector workers take the hit to balance the books. Now, everyone can see the irony, the Tories clapping key workers and now giving them a pay cut and threatening them with a sack in the future for future action. Does he really think ordinary people support Tory plans over the nurses? Does he realise the public can see Pat Cullen and Mick Lynch destroying their arguments in sound bites? Does he actually understand that train commuters who already suffer from appalling service are going to be raging when they find out how much money the train companies are making from strike days, paid for by the taxpayers? So how much money has been paid to the train companies that could have went to workers instead? Now, Mr. Speaker, it's not been easy for the Scottish Government, but they've negotiated better pay settlements for Police Scotland, for train crews and for NHS workers. And one for the NHS, it would seem that RCN would be willing to discuss with the UK Government. Actions commended by the unions, but not even acknowledged by Labour. But I would say there are no ambulance strikes in Scotland. And, Mr Speaker, this is done within a fixed budget. Negotiations with one hand tied behind our back. And now, despite working with the unions, Scotland still have the same anti-worker or anti-union legislation imposed on it against the wishes of the Scottish Government. An imposition made easier by the Labour Party agreeing with the Tories that workers' rights should remain at Westminster and not be devolved to Scotland. Mr Speaker, finally, we do not want to be part of plans designed to sabotage workers' rights. Once again, it is shown quite clearly if Scotland's become a fairer, more equal country that respects workers' rights, the only way to do it is to become a normal, independent country.
Well, Mr Speaker, the honourable gentleman tries to push the argument that somehow this will take us out of step with other European countries. I've already explained we're the ones who are out of step with what already occurs elsewhere in Europe. And if you go beyond Europe, the honourable gentleman will be interested to hear that in countries like Australia, in countries like Canada, in many states in America, blue light, as we would call it here, strikes are banned entirely. So actually we're taking a very moderate approach, a very sensible approach. I would have thought the honourable gentleman would wholeheartedly support protecting his own constituents in that way. And whilst we're taking sort of lectures from him about how the Scottish Government handles these things, Mr Speaker, I couldn't help notice that Scottish primary school teachers are on strike and secondary teachers go on strike in Scotland on Wednesday.
Sir Len Saxby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. In rural Britain, strikes have a disproportionate impact where there are not other modes of public transport. The nearest alternative hospital may be 60+ miles away, and ambulances have already travelled far further to get there, not to mention vacancy rates in public services are so high due to our housing crisis. Can my right honourable friend confirm how these measures will help support rural communities?
Well, my friend's absolutely right. These so-called forever strikes, which have continued for month after month on the railways, are particularly hurting the rural communities. It's very easy, I think, sometimes for people to imagine that people will just sit at their home, they'll be on Zoom, they'll be on Teams, they'll have those conversations. It's a view of the world which is much easier if you are at a desk job, perhaps in management, much harder if you're in a rural community, if you are the hospital porter who needs to get to the hospital, if you're a cleaner. The very people who are being hurt most by these strikes, which never seem to come to a conclusion on the railways, are the hardest up in society, and this government will stand behind them with minimum service levels.
Mr Speaker. 1 minute, Minister. You're clapping the key workers and next you're sacking the key workers. What's really behind this legislation, only time will tell. But why are you looking towards criminalising the great key workers who brought us through this pandemic, whose only crime is to demand decent wages, terms and conditions for themselves and also a safe environment for themselves and the general public?
Well, look, Mr Speaker, I appreciate the honourable gentleman is a very enthusiastic supporter of everything that the unions do, and they are an enthusiastic supporter of the honourable gentleman. But I don't understand why, perhaps not all of them, but I don't understand why anyone would seriously have an objection to making sure that if one of his constituents has a heart attack on Wednesday, or has a stroke, or a serious accident, why anyone would object to having a national level of agreed safe services. And that is what we propose, and I'm surprised that he will be voting against the safety of his own constituents.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Will my right honourable friend try and impress on the members opposite, who keep referring to this as an anti-union measure, that public support will be endangered for the unions if they do not preserve minimum services for people whose lives are at risk?
Mr Speaker, my right honourable friend makes an excellent point, which is what we're trying to do here is to correct a problem that is very current. And actually, Mr. Speaker, honourable and right honourable members opposite can actually help with this, because this Wednesday there is due to be a strike tomorrow where the ambulance workers, the unions, have not provided a national level of guaranteed safety. If they could help to correct that. In fact, if we can get this in place across the economy, and particularly in those vital services, then even though we'll take this primary power, we'll never need to use it. And that would be the ideal solution. So why don't they help us? Why don't they help bring safety to their own constituents? And that will help them, and it will help the unions.
Andy MacDonald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister has said that he supports the right to strike, and he's told us he does that by banning workers from striking. Doesn't he see the ridiculous position he's got himself into? And the whole point of having assessments of policy is to find out whether it's going to work or not. And when the government's told their policy is bonkers, the sensible thing is to bin it. And where does he think declaring war on working people is going to end?
Serious Day.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I've mentioned a couple of times in the dispatch box, the honourable gentleman would need to explain his position to his friends and colleagues in countries as radical as France and Spain, where they have these rules in place already, and they already act to solve people. This point about the impact assessment, which has been made several times, and I think actually also from the front bench. I should point out that the final impact assessment, because the final way in which this will operate, which is primary legislation and then secondary legislation, statutory instruments to bring it into place, is actually yet to be published. So he's wrong about the impact assessment as well. But how anyone can seriously argue that the impact of having guaranteed rescue by ambulances, for example, if somebody is seriously ill, could harm people is simply beyond belief.
Richard Drax.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Coming back through Heathrow recently, I was speaking to someone who works there, and they were praising the armed forces during the coverage of the border force and saying what an incredible job they did and how the whole process worked without any problems at all, and what a sad reflection it was on the public service in this particular area that they couldn't do the same thing. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that the other side and the unions and many who work in the public service have seemed to have forgotten that we spent £400 billion safeguarding their jobs, their futures and their careers?
Yeah. Serious Day.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I do want to pay tribute to the Army, who did fantastic work. The Army, of course, do have no strike clause already, along with the police. It will, once this primary powers have been taken, be up for Secretary of States, including the Home Secretary, to determine and consult in other areas for secondary powers to bring in minimum service levels. But you know, actually, I think most people in the public service, working in the public service, are doing a hugely valuable job. They're trying to do the best. I think many of them are frustrated by their radical union leaders, leading them often up a garden path.
Christine Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the right honourable member asked earlier if we would acknowledge the impact of COVID and Ukraine. Of course we would. We live with it every day. All of our constituents live with it every day. All of those working in the NHS and the ambulance service live with it every day. So when he says the British people need to know that when they have a heart attack, a stroke or a serious injury, that an ambulance will turn up, and that if they need hospital care, they have access to it, would he not agree with me that a better way of ensuring that is to deal with the actual problem, to invest, to recruit and retain staff in the NHS and the ambulance service, and provide the service that's being cried out for, not just by us, but by those people themselves, rather than tinker about with what you'll do when you can't solve it? Fix the problem might be a better way.
Well, I think the Honourable Lady is right in this sense, that because of COVID, we have seen these huge backlogs, and indeed we're hiring a lot more nurses, for example, as a result. Thousands more since 2019. We're also funding the healthcare system more than ever in history, some £168 billion to do that. And as the Prime Minister described in his speech last week, bringing down those waiting lists is his #1 priority. So we are doing all of those things as well. But it is undeniable that not having a minimum safety level in place during strike days puts lives at risk, and this government will take the responsible decision to prevent that from happening in the future.
Lee Anderson.
Mr. Speaker, now then, I think it's important to remember that public sector workers are employed by and paid for by the great British taxpayer. And whilst I sympathise with some of their demands, does my right honourable friend agree with me that their first loyalty should be to the British taxpayer and not some power-crazed union barons who fund the Labour Party and have in the past paid off Labour MPs' mortgages?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I want to pay tribute to particularly those in the NHS. There's a very good reason why over 1 million people in the NHS received a pay rise last year when the country was having a zero pay rise because of COVID in the public sector, and they did get a pay rise. The pay rise proposed at the moment is worth about £1,400 per individual. I appreciate that in these times and with Putin's evil war and the impact that's had on inflation, everyone would like more money as a pay rise, but a government's got to consider what that would do to people's taxes, what it would do to interest rates, what it would do to mortgage rates, and how we'd get into a circle, where we're never able to get inflation down. Inflation's the biggest evil of all. We're taking sensible steps to address it. That lot over there simply want to roll over and not address the difficult problems.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I refer to my register of interest. The Royal College of Emergency Medicine has highlighted how there is over 300 excess deaths every single week. So I'd like to know where the government's minimum service level agreement is to the public right now. But the best way to avert a strike is to negotiate. So within his legislation, what obligations will there be on government to enter meaningful negotiations, and how does he describe meaningful?
I just want to pick the Honourable Lady up on those figures, because the NHS themselves will say they don't recognise those numbers. And I do know for sure that when we have a strike, such as the one on Wednesday, where ambulance workers are going to go on strike, there's no way in which she or anybody else in this House can realistically argue that people will somehow be better off without a national minimum safe level of service. That is what we're going to focus on, and that is why she and the benches opposite should support this bill.
Laura Forrest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend was right to mention other European countries, but he could have added to that list South Africa, Argentina, Australia, Canada, all of which are members of the International Labour Organization, all of which have minimum service levels in essential services. And in every single case, the ILO has reviewed the MSL and determined it to be a necessary and proportionate restriction of the Article 11 right to strike. Does my right honourable friend agree that the British people are entitled to exactly the same lawful protection to have their basic needs met at times of industrial action in essential services?
Well, my honourable friend, Mr. Speaker, it's worth reminding the House, is an acknowledged expert in employment law, and I'm grateful for her thoughts and clarification that the International Labour Organization do say this is compatible with Article 11. I have been able to sign off the ECHR compatibility on this measure, because, as she rightly points out, it's not just our friends and neighbours in Europe, but around the world, where strikes are, in many cases, banned, not what we're proposing, but certainly minimum safety levels are in place. So there is nothing illegitimate about what we're doing. It fits with the ILO, and who signs up to the ILO? To TUC and many other unions besides.
Chris Stevens.
Mr. Speaker, every single concern that the Secretary of State and all those in the government benches have raised so far is already covered by existing legislation, because trade unions are legally obliged to provide life and limb cover. That's the existing law. So can the Secretary of State tell us what is the difference between his proposed legislation and the new legislation, because that will then be the test on whether this is an attack on workers or not.
Well, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman raises a good point, which I'm very pleased to answer. Where we have the strikes tomorrow and we can't get a simple answer to the question of what the national level of emergency cover will be for people in the most urgent of situations, heart attacks, strokes, other life-threatening ailments, that is the reason why we need minimum safety levels. When for many, many months some of the poorest in society have been unable to go to work to earn their own living, perhaps as a cleaner, as a hospital porter. That is why we need minimum service levels on our railways. And I very much hope the honourable gentleman will see the point, help to represent his constituents who are being prevented from earning money or indeed from being safe should they have an accident tomorrow.
Nicky Aiken.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Last week I met Daniel Jobs, who runs the Wardrobe Kitchen Bar and Restaurant in the city. He didn't open last week because he said it was no point because of the rail strike. Before Christmas he lost tens of thousands of pounds because of the rail strike, because people were just cancelling because they couldn't come in to central London. UK Hospitality calculates that around £1 billion of business was lost in central London because of the rail strikes. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that yes, it is right to protect the right to strike, but there must be legislation in place to protect other sectors like hospitality, protect businesses and protect from job losses?
Minister.
Well, our honourable friend makes an excellent point, and actually it brings me on to an important consideration, which is the disparity at the moment between the public sector settlements on offer and actually the average in the private sector at the moment, which has typically been lower. And so it is right that as a responsible government you have to balance off all of these different considerations across the economy. And for those running small businesses, tea rooms, pubs, the services sector, it is right that we consider them in this balance, which is why minimum service levels as well as minimum safety levels are absolutely right for this economy.
Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I've listened carefully to what the Secretary of State has had to say, and however he tries to dress it up, this is part of an alarming authoritarian drift. We've got an attack on the democratic right to strike, an attack on the democratic right to vote through attempted vote rigging through the introduction of voter ID, and an attack on the democratic right to peaceful protest. Isn't the Secretary of State ashamed to be a member of the most authoritarian government in Britain in living memory?
Minister.
Well, Mr Deputy Speaker, I've heard some stuff at this dispatch box, but the idea that this is the most authoritarian government, has he seen what happens in truly authoritarian states? It's actually absolutely ludicrous claim. Particularly in Marxist states, yeah, it's a ludicrous claim about British democracy. And actually, he can help with his many union links, because all we're saying is we'll take powers to ensure that the minimum safety level exists. We're also saying at the same time we don't need to use these powers. We simply need to get agreement for his constituents and for our constituents that on a strike day an ambulance would be able to turn up because national levels have been agreed. That is it, and he should get on board and support this.
Angela Richardson.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Last week, rail users in Guildford trying to get in and out of the constituency, including key workers, were completely cut off. There were 0 trains. At no point has the opposition condemned widespread strike action that disrupts the public. Will my right honourable friend agree with me and join with me in asking the opposition to back these measures that we are putting forward to keep the public safe, but to keep our economy going and growing?
Well, friends, absolutely right. If you look at whose side we're on people who are working hard, who are trying to get on with their lives and livelihoods, who are concerned about their lives when it comes to emergency services. If you look across the benches here, who are they interested in? They haven't once condemned these strikes. Not once have I heard them condemn these strikes. They've been inflicting people's lives now, month after month after month. Not a word from this side opposite. And when we try to bring in even the most moderate and considerate legislation, which simply says that we will ask for a minimum safety level, what do? They object to it and again attack their own constituents in the process.
Order. May I just gently remind members that Mr Speaker has determined that anybody who came in 5 minutes after the start of the session will not be called. Colin Eastwood.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I know that the Secretary of State likes to fly around in his own private plane, but I can tell him for a fact, whilst he's been doing that, nurses in my constituency, many of them, have been accessing food banks. This government seems very uncomfortable with nurses standing on picket lines, but totally relaxed
about them lining up to get food for their families at food banks. If this government is serious about stopping the strikes, surely now is the time, Secretary of State, to pay these essential workers properly.
Minister.
Well, I'd be interested to hear where the front bench's policy is to pay a 19% pay rise. And if they're going to do that, if they're able to explain how they'll raise the extra money, will that be extra taxation, Mr. Deputy Speaker? Will they be putting it on borrowing with all the hikes in interest rates, mortgage rates and car loans and the rest of it that would bring? That is the question that they need to answer. And the more they waffle around the subject, rather than actually bring forward serious measures to limit the impact of these strikes at the most serious point, the life and death point, the less they will get the respect of the general public.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. My right honourable friend is absolutely right to bring forward these proportionate measures, not least the urgency with which he seeks to protect the safety and lives of all of our constituents at risk from strike action. But when it comes to minimum service standards on the railways, will he agree with me that children have suffered in these strikes? Many children in Buckinghamshire use the railways to get to school, and that in the consultation that comes forward, the ability of children to get to school on the railways must be included in that minimum service level.
Well, my honourable friend makes an excellent point, because we've talked about workers getting to work, we've talked about people losing their salaries because of these strikes, but actually also children are being impacted with their education. And I think that is absolutely crying shame, particularly after 2 years of COVID, all of that having to study from home, to be put through this again when there is a decent offer on the table for railway, which, by the way, when union bosses have actually put to their members, with the TSSA, for example, they accepted the offer, a very similar offer to the ones that the RMT and other unions refuse to put to their members. So again, we just need some common sense from these unions, and I hope a little pushing from members opposite.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Can the Secretary of State not just for once acknowledge the stress levels of workers, postal workers, rail workers, health workers, teachers, who've had 10 years of frozen pay, 10 years of reducing living standards, going through enormous stress at work, many leaving the teaching and nursing professions as a result of it. Nobody likely votes to take strike action unless it's an act of desperation. They do it because they want to get decent pay for themselves and their loved ones and their families. Can he not, for once, face the issue of the poverty that people face, rather than trying to bring in draconian laws to prevent people taking effective action in order to remedy the injustice that they are currently facing?
Minister.
It's obviously not true, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that there's been pay freeze for 10 years. And it stands there and makes a claim. I just actually mentioned from the dispatch box that because the NHS was under huge pressure during COVID, actually nurses and workers in the NHS, 1.2 million I think in total, were provided an uplift last year of £1,400 I think, or £1,200 last year, £1,400 proposed this year, even though at the time inflation was low, even though the rest of the public sector wasn't receiving pay increases. But he talks about stress for public sector workers, and I do recognise the hard work that they put in and the hours that they put in, particularly in the NHS, which is why we've expanded by many thousand the number of nurses, for example. But what about the stress for people who can't get to work with these strikes and haven't been able to for months? What about the stress for people who might be waiting for an ambulance when we don't have nationally agreed safety levels in place? That's the stress that I'm also worried about.
Chris Loder.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree with me that when unions such as the RMT reduce their customary referendum period from 14 to 6 days to force through a false ballot result to strike, and then go to strike straight away against necessarily the wishes of all members, would he agree with me that this is an important piece, an important statement to make, an important piece of legislation, and will he confirm how promptly he will bring forward this bill to the House?
Minister.
Well, the bill itself is being introduced today. My honourable friend's absolutely right about this. One of the things that we saw with the RMT is that they haven't put the offers to their members, and I think that's a real problem. As I mentioned before, the TSSA had put an almost identical offer. It was accepted by the members, and the strike was therefore over. So I think any attempt to not allow members to see the full range, the full view of what is being offered is wrong. And because members haven't seen the full offer, they'll be unaware of the various different elements of that offer because it hasn't been formally put to their members. That is something that the unions can change immediately, and I very much hope that they do.
Joanne Cherry.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I noticed a moment ago that the Secretary of State said that striking workers were in danger of pushing up interest rates. Can I just remind him that many of these people are on strike because they can't afford their mortgages or their rent as a result of the hike in interest rates caused by his colleagues' economic incompetence. And I imagine that many of these essential workers are in receipt of the sort of wage that the Secretary of State wouldn't get out of bed for in the morning. Having said that, on the issue of the legality, of this legislation, the General Secretary of the TUC has said that to force workers who have democratically voted to strike, to force them to work and to sack them if they don't comply would almost certainly be illegal. Now, isn't that right? And can the Minister really say that in every respect the detail of his bill will comply with the United Kingdom Government's obligations both under ECHR and under international labour law? On the detail, Minister, what's the position?
Mr Deputy Speaker, I don't know if I'm correcting myself or correcting the Honourable Lady, but I wasn't saying that striking, well, I didn't mean to say at least, that striking workers push up interest rates. It's inflation that pushes up interest rates. So if you pay 19%, and if you did that across the economy, you would have to borrow the money. You would then have to have more borrowing, more debt, and therefore higher interest rates. And everybody would pay more in their mortgages, in their car loans. Businesses would pay more. That is the quite simple maths that I would have thought we've actually tested to destruction. And it would not make sense to go ahead along those lines. She asked specifically about the ECHR. I can confirm that this is ECHR compliant. My honourable friend has left her place now, talked about employment law and how this fits with the ILO and with the ECHR. I have been able to sign that. And I can further confirm that there is proof of this because many other countries, many of our neighbours already do exactly the same thing also within the ECHR.
Jonathan Gallis.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. May I proudly put on the record my register of interest as a former teacher and a former trade union member and representative for the NASUWT. Mr Deputy Speaker, I am very worried about seeing teachers going on strike because it's the pupils that will suffer the most, particularly disadvantaged pupils from areas like Stoke-on-Trent North, Kidsgrove and Torquay. And whilst I am a huge admirer of the incredible work teachers do, they are sadly being cajoled by barren bosses in unions like the Not Education Union, led by Bolshevik Balstead and Commie Courtney, with their Labour mates to force teachers out of the classroom and make sure that kids continue to suffer. What can we do to make sure pupils will not be victims any further?
Minister.
Well, minimum levels of service, of education and elsewhere will of course help. But again, I do just want to stress to the House, we are not legislating in order to necessarily want to or wish to introduce legislation in all these areas. That will be a matter for the House on secondary legislation. It will be a matter for further consultations. I very much hope that it does, though, give the unions and some of their supporters in this House the opportunity to stop and think about whether minimum safety is appropriate in their particular areas. And when it comes to teaching, I very much hope that they'll hold back from the threshold of strikes, which will be damaging to them and to the pupils.
Zara Sultana.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Nurses' pay down 20%, teachers' pay down 20%, firefighters' pay down 12%, junior doctors' pay down 26%. That's the consequences of 13 years of Tory rule. So let's be honest, let's talk about the real problem here. It's not workers going on strike, it's a Tory government and the economy that they've built that forces workers to strike. And this new anti-worker law would make things even worse, sacking teachers and nurses for striking for fair pay. So, Mr Deputy Speaker, surely the easiest, safest and fairest way of guaranteeing minimum service provision is to have nurses and firefighters and paramedics paid a decent wage with good conditions and the resources to do their jobs. Why won't he do that instead?
Well, I think perhaps the Honourable Lady might want to inquire from her front bench, most of them are gone now, but one or two still here, whether they would themselves support a 19% pay increase. And if they do, nice as it would be to do, how are they going to explain that to their constituents? How are they going to explain that to the financial markets as interest rates rise? And will they, if they do spread it across the entire economy, what will the impact be on the economy at large? And those are the simple but unfortunately difficult decisions that need to be made in government. And frankly, Mr Deputy Speaker, their failure to answer those basic questions are why they are not ready to run this country.
Jim Shannon. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's not often I get asked to halfway through, but I'm very pleased to do so.
You're moving up the order.
Anyway, the sentiments expressed in this chamber about seeking a solution do not appear to be matching the negotiations outside of this chamber. The Secretary of State will know that for many of the NHS staff, this is not just about monies alone, it's also about safety in the wards, with many nurses stating that they would be happy with additional staff to lighten the load, along with a modest payroll to cover the cost of living. Can the Secretary of State indicate what assessment has been made about safety in the wards in light of ongoing action? And will the Secretary of State guarantee safety and a cost of living wage increase?
Minister. Mr Deputy Speaker, of course one of the reasons why we've been employing thousands, tens of thousands now, of more nurses, doctors, is to help to relieve the pressure post-COVID. And I think we all understand that given what happened in COVID and given what's now happened with flu, which is the worst for 10 years, we're seeing particularly strong pressures on our hospitals. The point that I'm making today is none of this is helped by the uncertainty. Fine to withdraw your labour, obviously a last resort, but we understand it. But please, give us an indication, or guarantee at least, of where the safety level will be, and do so on a nationwide basis, in fairness to the nurses and the Royal College of Nurses, just as they've done, but not, I'm afraid, as has been done with the ambulance unions, and we invite them to do the same thing.
Thank you very much, Mr Deputy Speaker. The government's failed industrial relations approach has led to the worst strikes in decades, and sadly they've often sought to scupper talks at the last minute by throwing in last-minute spanners. And now they're proposing to go from clapping nurses to actually sacking nurses. The Secretary of State will be aware that the Transport Minimum Service Level Bill's impact assessment stated that imposing minimum service levels could actually increase the frequency of strikes. So what exactly has changed in the last 2 months since that was published?
Minister. Well, first of all, no one is talking about sacking nurses. In fact, I've just checked the figures. Over 44,000 more nurses since 2010, over 34,000 more doctors, big increase even from 2019. Nothing that we are announcing today in this bill from the dispatch box, Mr Deputy Speaker, is about getting rid of nurses any more than any employment contract has to be followed. It's worth remembering that the pay that is on offer is as a result of the independent pay review body. Bodies that the unions themselves called to be set up 20 years ago being put into action. And on the point about last-minute spanners, I have heard union bosses make this point. It's completely untrue. I seem to somehow be living rent-free in Mitt Lynch's head at the moment. I haven't even been close to these negotiations. The deal that's on the table is the same discussion that's always been there. Rather than parroting those lines, the honourable gentleman might do better to check the facts and actually encourage the unions to put these offers to their members.
David Linden.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. When the Tory party spoke about taking back control, none of us thought it would be suppressing votes with voter ID legislation, a policing and crime bill that curbs the right to protest, a House of Lords with unelected clerics, and a government that's withdrawing the basic fundamental human right to strike. How much longer is this government going to continue that this silly little island is now a functioning democracy?
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'm pretty sure the honourable gentleman was in here from the beginning, otherwise you wouldn't have called him to speak, Mr. Deputy Speaker. And he therefore will have heard me said, not once or twice, but I think 3 times now, that this legislation is compatible with the International Labour Organization that the unions themselves sign up to, and that we see all of our, or many of our European nations follow. So I'm rather struggling to follow his argument that this is somehow unfair or undemocratic or somehow against international law.
Yeah. Mr. Deputy Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker, you think from the way the Secretary of State is speaking, and he is resorting to being the knight on a white charger coming to rescue the system. But let's be clear, it was this government that froze pay in the public sector and then increases below inflation. It's this government that reduced recruitment in the National Health Service, particularly among nurses, and we have a 40,000 gap just in them alone. What we're actually hearing, aren't we, is chickens coming home to roost, and he ought to take responsibility as a minister in this government.
Minister.
Well, I simply made the point that it's not the case that we've frozen recruitment because we've got 44,000 more nurses, not fewer nurses. So that's an increase rather than a decrease. It's also not the case, other than during the aftermath of the financial crash, which, as I recall, happened under the party opposite, and we had to pick up, and through COVID, but as I mentioned, not all the way through COVID, because last year, even whilst the rest of the public service was experiencing a freeze in pay, we paid more for the unions, for the workers in the NHS. So we made an exception to them. So it's simply, her narrative's simply not true. And I don't understand, again, that if her and her front bench and her party are saying they would pay 19% more, where is that money coming from? And whose taxes are going to be raised in order to pay for that and the increased interest rates?
Sam Tarry.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I draw the House as my register of interest. Mr. Deputy Speaker, what I find astonishing is I didn't realise we were comparing with France and with Spain. We're talking about Franco's Spain and the Vichy regime of France. In this country, we already have so many elements of our laws which do not comply with ILO regulations. We are one of the most restrictive anti-worker countries in the world, and that, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is a fact. What I would like to see, what my constituents would like to see, is this government stop blowing up the talks with trade unions, as they did against the NHS over this weekend, with Unite Reps coming out of that meeting in a worse state of having moved things forward, or dropping in driver-only operation into talks to blow it up with the RMT. This government, Mr. Deputy Speaker, could end the strikes in multiple sectors. Instead, what they've done is up the ante to wage war on working people suffering because of their rancid government.
Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, at least we know where the honourable gentleman stands, because against the instructions from this front bench, it's on the picket lines. And he's one of the people who's helped to extend these strikes on rail. Things like driver-only operation have been there right from the outset. There's been absolutely no change in that at all. It makes perfect sense. It actually operates on the line that my constituency happens to be on. It causes no problems at all. It's a very safe way to operate. It's the kind of modernisation that would help to bring this industrial dispute to a close. And his point about, I didn't follow that, about France and Spain. Franco, the Vichy government, I mean, Spain and France have moved on just a little bit from that and seem to manage, under the International Labour Organization, have minimum safe levels of service on strike days.
Lockhart.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State opened his statement with very warm words regarding our key workers, but he will be acutely aware that the longer that the government refuses to address the fair pay demands of key workers, the more staff morale is depleting and the more people will leave the service, exacerbating the staffing crisis highlighted by the unions as part of their demands. Does the Secretary of State not see that standing here lecturing about safe staffing levels when healthcare workers across the UK are saying staffing levels are unsafe is quite frankly ridiculous, and that the way to ensure staffing at all times is to pay our healthcare workers properly?
Minister.
Mr. Speaker, of course we want to see healthcare workers paid, and I meant the words that I used right at the top of this. Members of the House will remember my father was ill during COVID. I experienced the NHS at its best and most heroic whilst they were struggling to serve people under almost unbelievable pandemic circumstances. So I absolutely agree with her about the incredible work they do. There is a pay offer on the table that hasn't been invented by the government. It's come from the independent. We should ignore the independent pay review bodies. They need to explain why that